So kia ora, Nisambula Vinaka, Namaste, Assalamu alaikum, Malolele, Talofa, Noya, and warm Pacific greetings. Welcome to the August webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, a few housekeeping rules. In true Pacific style, our webinars are quite informal, so we welcome a good talanoa at the end of the presentation. We have a Facebook group page, a Twitter, a YouTube account, and a web page. I'll post the links in the chat box. So if you do want to join up to any one of those or follow any one of those pages, please do so. We also post the videos of the recordings of the webinars on those platforms, so you can watch them there as well if you want to catch up on something that you missed during the presentation. I'll also, in the coming week, on those platforms, I'll post the flyer for our next webinar and the details for that as well. If you want to join our mailing list, just put your email in the chat or send it in a private message to me, and I will add you to the mailing list as well. There are two ways in which you can engage with the webinar. You can type any comments or questions in the chat, and I will ask them on your behalf at the end of the presentation. Or what we do encourage is that at the end of the presentation, you unmute yourself and ask your questions and engage with the presenter. Finally, I request that you keep your mic on mute during the presentation. And those are our housekeeping rules. So I'd like to welcome our presenter for our August webinar, Ragni Prasad. Ragni hails from Nadi, Fiji, and is currently residing in Sydney. She's an advocate of maintenance of heritage languages, particularly in transnational migrant contexts. And to promote and achieve this, she's pursuing her PhD in sociolinguistics from the University of Wollongong. The topic of her dissertation is language maintenance and bilingualism in the Indian migrant community in Australia. Her focus group are first and second generation Indian migrants from India, and the focus language is Hindi. This webinar will present the methodology employed and the preliminary results of her investigation. Over to you, Ragni.
Thank you, Jalal, for the warm welcome. Yes, so you've told the topic of my presentation and the focus area as well. So good evening to everyone. Ram Ram if you're from Fiji and you speak Hindi, and Bula if you're from Fiji as well. If it is cold, like it is here in Sydney mostly, you can sit back and relax and enjoy with a cup of tea. And I like where the group is a bit small, they can have more conversations and can be more informal as well. I would like to do an acknowledgement of the countries. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet today and upon which the University of Wollongong is situated as well. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I also acknowledge their continued spiritual and cultural connection to country. So just a bit about this project. So this is my part of my PhD that I'm doing in social linguistics from University of Wollongong. The topic of my investigation is language maintenance and bilingualism in the Indian migrant community. So probably I can give a bit of background as well. So we migrated from Fiji to Australia in 2010. By then I had almost finished my master's in applied linguistics, and I had decided that's it, that's enough of studying, and especially moving to a new country where you have to adapt and do so much more. However, probably around 3 or 4 years, driving from Sydney down to Wollongong for work, one day I thought, oh, I have nothing much to do at the moment. I should be studying more. And then that's when it hit, okay, what would I do next? Must be a PhD then. And I would say Pranit has always been an inspiration to me. And so decided what areas to look at thought a bit, did a lot of discussions and stuff, and I realized I wanted to do something in relation to my own language. And so I firstly started looking at teaching of Hindi in New South Wales. And then I realized, what am I doing? What am I teaching at the moment? I'm teaching English as a second language and academic English as well. And I thought, I was thinking more about the future prospects of jobs and stuff. And I thought I should change my focus, but I still wanted to concentrate around my own heritage language as well. So therefore, I came up with this topic of language maintenance and bilingualism. However, during discussions with my then supervisors, I was probably rightly told that probably at that time, the prospect of studying Fiji Hindi was not that much for a PhD. And so then I had to, maintaining the focus on Hindi, then I had to study Indian migrants from India. So I hope my Fiji Indian participants here are not too disappointed. Later on, that's already there in the bucket list that has to be done as well. Now, so therefore, to achieve this goal, I studied the patterns of language use of Indian migrants in different contexts with various interlocutors. And this was to determine the extent to which Indian migrants are maintaining their heritage languages, or if language shift was in play, leading to monolingualism in English. Now, it is necessary to study the patterns of language use in migrants in different contexts, because the linguistic code that the speaker chooses in these different situations, and particularly in the home domain as well, reflects the value that the speaker gives to the language, the perception he or she has of it, of the interlocutor, the context where he or she feels it should be used, and so on, according to Benatti and Tarantini. And these values and perceptions are very important because they do determine whether a language is on the trend of being maintained or if there is language shift in play. So that is why I have this focus here. Now, there is a huge research gap in regards to study of Indian migrant languages in Australia. According to the research, and quite in-depth research that I have done so far, there's only one study that was done in 2007 by Fernandez and Klein, and that was conducted on 7 Indian families who were residing in Melbourne, and these were Tamil-speaking Indian and Sri Lankan families. So after that, there has not been a study that I have come across on the linguistic skills and repertoire of Indian migrants in Australia. And this is despite Indian migrants being the second largest group of Indians residing in Australia by 2021 at 721,000. And this is also despite Hindi being identified as one of the 4 priority Asian languages in Australia in 2012. And this gap also exists despite Australia and India's strengthening trade, strategic, political, and people-to-people relationships over the years. So one must have thought, considering all this, there could have been, or there would have been quite a lot of research done in terms of Hindi and the linguistic repertoire of Indian migrants, but unfortunately not. So in order to do the whole study for the PhD, the research method that I employed was a mixed method approach, where I used both quantitative and qualitative methods. For the qualitative method, surveys in the form of questionnaires were the primary method of data collection. There were 230 surveys that were being conducted. And the qualitative method consisted of 30 semi-structured interviews and 10 field observations. The participants were first and second generation Indian migrants. There were 168 first generation migrants and 62 second generation migrants. And the study was conducted in the Greater Sydney area. And that's where I live. Just a bit of background on this on the participants of my study. So one of the things I wanted to find out was what was the first language of the first generation participants. And as you will see here, there's a variety of languages, and that we would know as well from our readings and knowledge that Indian migrants are highly multilingual, right? And of course, there are so many different languages being spoken in India as well. So for the participants of my study, Hindi was the most common first language in the first generation. This was led by Punjabi and Marathi, and then followed by Malayalam and other languages. Now, what were some of the other languages that Indian migrants spoke? So in addition to their first language, so the other languages, the most common was English, 15%, followed by English and Punjabi. Now, these 15% of the participants were the only participants who were bilingual. So the rest of the 85% of the population were multilingual, the first generation. And we can see that there were participants who spoke 5 different languages, and quite many of them spoke 4 different languages or 3 languages. So this was the data for the first generation migrants' first language. It continues for their first language, and again shows multilingualism, and it also shows Hindi being spoken as a second language by the majority of the participants as well. So together, Hindi together with being the first language is also the second language for the majority of the participants. Coming to the second generation, the most common first language for the second generation was also Hindi for about 26% of the participants. However, the second most common first language for second generation participants was English, which was almost 30%. And the third one was Punjabi. So we can see that at least 18% of the second generation had already identified English as their first language. However, there were no tests done for any of the language skills or skills to identify the proficiency or in any of the languages. It's all what the participants had reported. For the second language, for second or other languages for the second generation, you can see that they are quite multilingual as well. There were 33% of the second generation who reported to be bilingual, whereas the rest of the 77% reported to be multilingual as well. But English was one of the most common languages as together with Hindi for both the first and the second language for the second generation participants. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the results of the Indian migrants' patterns of language use in the home domain only. Overall, we have looked at, or have looked at, their patterns of language use in the public domain as well. And so why the home domain? Because according to Powell's, it's the home domain that plays one of the most significant roles in the processes of language maintenance overall. Right? And according to Powell's, it's a stronghold for the use of minority or heritage languages as well. And she also says that this is one of the domains that presents migrants a choice of language to be used and exposed to subsequent generations as well. And this choice is very important, and it does impact the process of language retention and shift as well. And it's also one of the domains where the probability of belonging to the same ethno-linguistic group is very high. And this also determines, determining the language used, it determines the whether the language is going to be maintained or not. According to Fishman, multilingualism always begins or often begins in the home and depends upon it for encouragement, if not for protection, at least. And the family domain is one that shows more resistance to displacement of heritage languages compared to other domains. So this shows the huge impact that the home domain plays in relation to language maintenance and language attrition as well. Considering that, we look at the patterns of language use in the home domain. So what happened in the study was that the respondents were presented with certain situations with different interlocutors, and the respondents had to choose the most common language that they would have used or they would be using in that particular situation. So, for example, the respondents who were married, and 161 of the first generation were married and only 10 of the second generation were married. They had to identify the most common language they used with their spouse. Now, the two situations, the first situation was more of a personal situation where you would discuss more of a family matter with the family member, whereas the second situation was always looking at an English genre. So for example, if they watched a TV program, an English TV program, what language would they use to discuss the contents of that program? Now, with the first generation, in order to look at the language they used with their spouse, I will highlight more of the most common language. So amongst the first generation, we can see that in Indian heritage languages, so they were given a choice between Hindi, English, and an Indian regional language. I couldn't give them a choice of all Indian regional languages. It's too complicated. In the pilot study, I also asked if they used more than one language, which is a very frequent occurrence. A lot of them do it, but the data entry and analysis becomes so complicated. So I had to just stick to the most common language that they used. And so amongst spouses, the first generation, we can see mostly used their Indian heritage languages. Only to discuss an Indian genre, almost 20% of them used English. For the second generation, now we can see that use of English was greater in the second situation where they were discussing an English TV program, but it was a bit high in the first situation as well, where they were discussing a family matter, such as buying a present for their children. 60% of them used their heritage language, but 40% also used English. And whenever we talk about parents' use of language amongst themselves, it also reflects sort of the transmission to the next generation. And the language used between parents does determine the transmission rate to a large extent, and it is reflected in the study here as well. The second interlocutors were their firstborn or the eldest child. For the first generation, we can see there's a high degree of use of Indian heritage languages with the eldest child. About 30% used English with to discuss a family matter, and about almost half of them used English when they were discussing an English TV program, for example. When we look at the second generation, we can see that Hindi is not being used. Only 29% of them used an Indian regional language. And as we saw, there's a number of other languages which were identified as the first language, like Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and so on. So those would be the languages that would have been spoken. With the youngest child, now with the first generation, we can see that there's an increase in the use of English. So there's a decrease in the use of heritage languages. With the second generation, the data, the statistics was the same. The 71% used English, whether it was the first, whether the eldest or the youngest child, and only 29% used in Indian regional language. So it was pretty consistent in the second generation. In order to use the language, or in order to determine or to study the language used by the interlocutors or the respondents with their parents. So the majority of the first generation participants used Indian heritage languages with their parents. Only 8% of them reported using English, and these 8% were mostly Anglo-Celtic Indians, as they had identified in the study at various times as well. Whereas with the second generation, we can see that they also use Indian heritage languages to a large extent, but 37% of them used English with their parents, and 48% if they were discussing an English genre. I would say this is quite high as well, because parents are supposed to be the main transmitters of the heritage language, and they are the main agents of maintenance of heritage languages as well. So if they are talking to their parents mostly in English, that reflects the language they would be using with their siblings, and that also makes us then think of the language they would potentially be using in future with the third generation. So it's a cycle that we are looking at here, and the implications that it is going to have. With their siblings, so for the first generation, with the eldest sibling, majority of them used their Indian heritage languages. But when it came to, for the second generation, the trend changed. Majority of them used English with their eldest sibling. The results for the younger siblings were pretty much the same, where the first generation used English slightly more with the younger sibling, but the second generation used English to a large extent. And probably we could say that this was probably could be a reflection of their use with their parents and other interlocutors as well. However, when it comes to grandparents, this is one of the times we probably get a bit happy, because this is when we see the maintenance of heritage languages the most. So with the first generation, only 6% used English, and the second generation as well, only about 13 or 14% on average used English. So this proves to be one of the strongest agents of maintenance of heritage languages, probably not only in this community, but in most other communities as well. In the friendship circle, so they were asked to identify the language, the most common language they used, if they were with friends from the same region in India, as well as with friends from a different region in India. So if they were with the friends from the same region, majority of the first generation respondents reported using their heritage languages. And these friends would mostly be around their same age as well, and adults as first generation migrants as well. So probably it is more expected. Whereas for the second generation, now, although the migrants or their friends would be from the same generation, from same region in India, 71% of them reported using English. So this tells us that although the second generation could be from the same region in India, they would still be mostly inclined to be using English. Whereas if the friend was from a different region in India, for the first generation, only 32% of them used English, whereas the rest of them used Indian heritage languages. And this was one situation where we saw an increase in the use of English. In Hindi. And this was highly reported as well in the fieldwork, that Hindi was used as a lingua franca amongst Indians from different regions in India, as well as amongst Indian migrants from India and the migrants from other neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and so on. So Hindi was identified as a very strong lingua franca there. Second generation, mostly English was used. The religious domain played a significant role, and this was one of the agents of maintenance of heritage languages. Hindi was mostly used while praying at temples, but the second generation used English to some extent. However, when it came to religion, majority of the participants were Hindus, but there were a good number who were Christians as well. So use of English then was pretty much expected, I would say. So very quickly, a summary of the results. So for the first generation, overall, there was a high degree of use of Indian heritage languages. And this was mostly used intergenerationally to converse with the elders, not with the children, just with the elders, and intragenerationally with their spouse, with their siblings and friends and so on. However, with the children, there was a decline and a substantial decline in the use of heritage languages, but this did differ between families and individuals as well. For the second generation, now only half of the second generation reported using heritage languages with their spouses in the home domain. And as I said before, this does reflect use with other interlocutors. And this it does correlate with only a third of them reporting to be using heritage languages with their children. And that obviously is a strong indication of low rates of transmission of heritage languages to the third generation as well. If it is not used between the first and second generation, we can't expect wonders to happen that it would be used with the third generation as well. However, generalizations would have to be cautionary, as only 14% of the second generation in my study were married and only 11% of them had children. Nevertheless, all the married respondents were in endogamous marriage, with almost all of them being married to an Indian from India, or the rest, few were married to an Indian from an Indian diaspora. So that's significant as well. But it does also indicate that language shift is in progress in the second generation Indian migrants, despite endogamous marriage. And the first generation were all in endogamous marriage as well. Just a bit more on the second generation. So use of heritage languages with interlocutors was also very low, except for the grandparents and the older relatives. So the implication of all this, it can be suggested that language shift is in play in the second generation. Now, what were some of the significant agents of language maintenance in the Indian migrant community? So this was based on the overall results of the study. And some I have already highlighted here. So multiple generations residing together, language policies at home. So parents who were quite strict about use of language, especially heritage language, were epitomes of language maintenance, and vice versa as well. Now, the Hindi school also was identified as a significant agent of maintenance of heritage language, and especially Hindi. Children who were able to attend a Hindi school were generally quite proficient in the Hindi language and in other Indian heritage languages as well. However, access to a Hindi school was quite challenging for most of the students and for the children, and this is something I've highlighted in the thesis as well. The religious domain played a significant role, as well as Bollywood. So if you know the Indian culture, Bollywood plays a very significant role. And a lot of the first as well as second generation migrants are quite heavily involved with Bollywood, and that helps in the maintenance of the language to a large extent, and especially Hindi. And trips back to the homeland. One of the other questions I asked in the later part of the study was how often they visited India and what was the most common language. majority of them spoke in their heritage languages when they went back home. And that was also identified as one of the most common reasons for maintenance of heritage languages amongst the Indian migrants, which was probably expected as well. The factors that led to language attrition, mostly school-age children. So a lot of parents reported the eldest child was pretty proficient in their heritage language up till probably the age of 5, or as soon as they started going to school, they could witness English protruding into the home domain and first being used with the younger siblings. Right? And so the younger siblings in that way got more exposed to English, and conversations between the siblings mostly then went ahead in English. So that really impacted competence in heritage languages. Attitude of parents as well. It has both positive and negative impacts. Parents who were concerned and who reported having policies in their homes were epitomes of language maintenance, but there were a few parents or some parents who were not very much concerned, and so the languages were not maintained in their homes. And lack of access to Hindi schools as well, as I identified before. And that brings it to the end of my presentation. Thank you, Dhanyavad and Vinaka. And I would love to engage with the few of you who are here. If there's any opportunities, it would be wonderful to work with you and communicate later on as well. Any questions? I'm happy to take them.